Chapter 18, Americans Move West. Section 1, Westward Ho. Mining boom brings growth. Americans continued to move west during the 1800s. The American frontier, which used to be the Ohio River Valley when we first formed our country, now has stretched all the way to the Pacific Ocean when California was added to the Union in 1850. And as we know, the gold rush is what made California a state. Mining was a big business. And with discoveries of large deposits of precious metals in places such as the Comstock Lode in Nevada, more people were going out west to discover these metals. So when a group of people come to mine in an area, you see the development very quickly of something called a boom town. These were communities that grew quickly when a mine opened. And when that mine, was closed, usually those boom towns disappeared as well. Now there are some that stayed around, some boom towns that continue to thrive. For example, San Francisco is an example of a boom town that never went away. But that's, if you see in the picture here, this is an example of a boom town, by the mining areas. The cattle industry was another area of rapid growth. Cattle ranching had spread across the Great Plains, creating something called the Cattle Kingdom that stretched from Texas to Canada. Now, this was a busy time period, but it was a short time period because as more and more people started getting into the cattle business, and as people started buying more land and, blocking it off with barbed wire, and with all the cattle eating off the grass in the prairies, that kind of brought the cattle kingdom to an end. Now, taking care of the cattle were the cowboys. These are the cowboys that we're familiar with in TV shows. Not quite the way they looked in TV shows and movies, but cowboys were workers who took care of the rancher's cattle and led the cattle drives. They weren't always going around shooting people like you see in movies. One of the most famous cattle drives was called the Chisholm Trail, and it was a popular route for cattle drives from San Antonio to Abilene, Kansas. So if you look at the map here, San Antonio's down here, and the cattle drive would take it all the way up to a city in Kansas called Abilene, Kansas. That was the Chisholm Trail. As more and more people began moving westward, the need to get goods and information from the East Coast to the West Coast started to increase. And so in the 1860s, a system of messengers on horseback were called the Pony Express. Now they carried messages on a route 2,000 miles long, however, was put out of business by the telegraph line. So once the telegraph was invented, it pretty much put the Pony Express out of business because there was no need for him to ride across the country anymore. You could just send a telegraph. But that will also lead to the creation of a Transcontinental Railroad because you want to get goods out west as well. So there's this race to make this Transcontinental Railroad. What that means is a railroad that would extend across the country. And various railroad companies got into this so-called race to build that first railroad. You have a company called the Central Pacific, which started in the city of San Francisco and worked east. And then you had the Union Pacific, who started in the city of Omaha, Nebraska, and started working westward. Now, as it turns out, the two lines are going to meet with each other. And on May 10th, 1869, the railroad lines met and joined the two tracks with a golden spike at a city called Promontory, Utah. So if we extend this map here, here is San Francisco over here. Here's Omaha, Nebraska. And as they worked their way across the country, it met right there in Utah, at Promontory, Utah, where they put in the golden spike. It's kind of the symbolic end of the track. And that is the first transcontinental railroad built in the United States. As you can see in this picture, this was the final picture taken when the tracks were met and completed. And you see all the workers who were involved in the making of this Transcontinental Railroad. A large number of the people who were involved in the building of this railroad were Chinese immigrants. In 1862, Congress passed two important land grant acts to help open the West up to settlers. The first one was called the Homestead Act, and it gave government-owned land to small farmers. Any adult who was a U.S. citizen or planned to become one could receive 160 acres of land. Pretty good deal. The second act was the Morrill Act, and it gave federal land to states to sell in order to fund colleges that taught agriculture and engineering. The act required each state to sell this land. They couldn't keep it, so they had to sell the land and use the money to build these colleges. And with the more and more people moving out west, one of the biggest groups that started moving westward were African Americans from the South, and they became known as exodusters. If you look at the word exoduster, the key word, part of that word is exodus. They're leaving the South and moving to Kansas, hoping for a new way of life. During the time period of 1860 to 1900, the number of farms that were created tripled, which led to a lot of productivity of crops. But when you have a lot of crops, the prices are lower because there's just so much of it, and that was due to overproduction. So overproduction can be a bad thing. So if all these farmers were growing corn and you have tons of corn and your livelihood depends on corn, and there's just so much of it, the price goes down because there's just too much corn for everyone to buy. And so that will hurt farmers. Many farmers will lose their farms and their homes, and they will become something known as tenant farmers. A tenant farmer worked the land owned by other people. By 1880, 1/4 of all the farms were rented by tenants, and the number just kept growing from there. Okay, so farmers formed associations to help protect them and their interests. One organization was founded by a guy named Oliver Hudson Kelley, who with the government created an organization called the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry. That was in 1867. Now, of course, it was shortened to the National Grange, but it was a social and educational organization for farmers that supported laws to regulate railroad rates. Farmers blamed business people, wholesalers, brokers, grain buyers, and most especially railroad owners for making money at their expense. Congress will pass the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887 to provide regulations for trade. You're trying to control trade going across state lines. But these laws were never really enforced. And so the Interstate Commerce Act was not very powerful. Money issues also caused problems for farmers. Many farmers hoped that help would come from new laws affecting the money supply. Now, since 1873, the United States had been on something called the gold standard, meaning that all paper money had to be backed by gold in the Treasury. Now, as a result of this, the money supply grew more slowly than the nation's population, and this leads to something called deflation, which is a decrease in the money supply and overall lower prices. Now, one of the solutions that were made was to allow unlimited coining of silver and to back the paper currency with silver as well. So this movement became known as the Free Silver Movement. And farmers supported this unlimited coining of silver, so Congress will pass the Sherman Silver Purchase Act to increase the amount of silver purchased for coinage. However, it did not help farmers. These farmers' alliances formed a new political party called the Populist Party to support government ownership of railroads and communication systems, to support the free silver movement and labor regulations. So the farmers will support, and the Populists will support their first presidential candidate named William Jennings Bryan in the election of 1896. However, he did not have a lot of support, and his defeat in this election will mark the end of the Farmers Alliance and the Populist Party. So it was a very short-lived political party. By 1870, only small portions of the Great Plains remained unsettled. For most of the next 2 decades, this land remained open range. In March 1889, government officials announced that homesteaders, those are the people who got the free land, could file claims on land in what is now the state of Oklahoma. This land had once belonged to the Creek and Seminole Indians. Within about a month, about 50,000 people rushed to Oklahoma to stake their claims. In all, the settlers claimed more than 11 million acres of former Indian land in this famous Oklahoma land rush. This wave of pioneers was the last chapter of the westward movement. By the early 1890s, there was no more frontier. So the frontier ceased to exist in the United States by the early 1890s. That is the end of Section 1.